In the summer of 1984, a decorated police officer and his teenage daughter vanished on a road trip through the American West. No crash site, no bodies, no goodbye. For 16 years, the case sat in silence until a bloodstained suitcase surfaced near a dry Montana Creek bed. Inside, a broken badge, a girl's locket, and an unopened letter. The name on the envelope matched the missing girl, but the DNA inside didn't match her father. Someone else was there, someone who never came forward, until now. The photograph was taken by a stranger at a gas station just outside of Boise. It was one of those spontaneous, blurry moments, the kind that usually ends up in a shoebox, forgotten until years later. But this one would become a relic. In it, Officer Glenn Harlan stands beside his vintage Dodge Diplomat, hand resting protectively on the shoulder of his daughter, Mara. His uniform is pressed, polished, gleaming under the midday sunday. She's holding a road map, slightly curled at the edges, her other hand shielding her eyes from the glare. They are both smiling, though not at the camera, at each other. It's the kind of smile that holds history, unspoken understanding, and the weight of things unsaid. Before we trace the footsteps that vanished at mile marker 237, the voice that broke through static, and the suitcase that bled secrets into the soil, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just unsolved cases, they're the echoes of people who were once here, who mattered, and who were forgotten by everyone but memory. Your support doesn't just help us uncover what was lost, it helps us listen when the past tries to speak. One click brings their names back into the light. Thank you. No one knew that this image would be the last trace of them. They had planned the trip months in advance. Glenn had taken leave from the precinct. Mara had deferred her orientation at Oregon State. The idea was simple. One last summer together, father and daughter, retracing old memories across forgotten highways before she started her own life. They would take the scenic route cutting through Idaho, skimming Montana, dipping into the edge of Wyoming. Camping, cheap diners, roadside motels with flickering neon signs. Glenn said it would be like rewinding time, back to the days before everything grew complicated. To neighbors, it seemed wholesome. Touching, even. Glenn had raised Mara alone after her mother died in '77. He wasn't the warmest man, but he was steady, responsible. He didn't drink. He didn't date. His world was his daughter and his badge, and in that order, colleagues called him by the book. Mara used to joke he was by the whole library. But there were things she didn't joke about. The way he would double-check every lock. The way he insisted on choosing the motels. The way he sometimes pulled over and just stared into the rearview mirror for long, silent stretches of road. They left on a Thursday morning, August 16th. Glenn had packed the car with military precision. Spare tires, extra water, a first aid kit, even a portable police scanner. Mara brought a journal, sketch pads, a Sony Walkman, and enough cassette tapes to soundtrack the entire journey. She told her best friend they'd be back in 2 weeks. "It's just a bonding thing," she'd said. "Dad's been tense lately, wants some closure, I guess." 2 days later, the Diplomat was spotted in Salmon, Idaho. Glenn bought jerky and coffee at a roadside convenience store. Mara wasn't with him. The clerk didn't think anything of it. A man alone, buying road snacks, harmless, then nothing. No credit card activity, no phone calls, no confirmed sightings. The car never made it to Oregon. They vanished into the folds of America's wilderness without a trace. At first, it didn't seem urgent. A missed check-in, a late arrival. Glenn was a cop. Maybe he changed their route. Maybe they lost signal. But by the 4th day, concern became panic. By the end of the week, an official report had been filed. By the end of the month, the case was closed as missing, presumed dead. The Polaroid would resurface years later, pinned to a bulletin board in Glenn's old precinct. A reminder of the things even police officers can't outrun. A smiling man in uniform, A girl with a folded map. Frozen in time, unaware of the darkness just beyond the frame. It's easy to miss mile marker 237. A faded green sign, barely visible through the dust and scrub, clings to a bent steel post off US Route 93. The asphalt buckles slightly where the shoulder begins to erode into dry earth. No towns for miles. No gas stations. Just the endless rhythm of empty road flanked by yellow grass and rust-colored rock. On most maps, this stretch is forgettable, just a seam between state lines. But for Glenn Harlan and his daughter, Mara, it was the last place they ever existed. The sun that day was merciless. Locals remembered it was the kind of August heat that vibrates off the road in ghostly waves, bending the horizon like a mirage. Truckers passed through, windows rolled down, radios crackling with static. A few said they remembered seeing an older Dodge idling on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly. No one stopped. Why would they? A cop car on a breakdown isn't cause for concern. But no calls for assistance were ever recorded. No radioed mechanical issues, just silence. The motel reservation had been made days in advance, a one-night stay at a roadside inn near the Idaho-Montana border. 2 beds, non-smoking. Glenn had confirmed the booking himself. But when the manager checked the logbook that evening, the room was still untouched. The beds made, the bathroom unused, no sign of entry. The Harlans had simply disappeared between point A and point B, like a dropped pin sliding off a map. It wasn't just that the car was missing, it was the total absence of trace. No tire marks in the dirt, no receipts, no witnesses who could definitively place them beyond that last sighting in Salmon. It was as if the road swallowed them whole. Investigators combed the surrounding area, brought in dogs, even dispatched helicopters to scan the ravines and creeks that crisscrossed the valley. Still, nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a scrap of metal, not even a misplaced cassette from Mara's backpack. There was speculation, of course. Maybe they ran off the road, plummeted into one of the countless canyons that break open like scars along the region. But those places were searched thoroughly. Others suggested foul play and ambush, maybe. But by whom? And for what? Glenn wasn't just a cop. He was a well-respected officer with no known enemies. Yet, off the record, a few officers hinted he'd been acting strangely before he left. Nervous, distracted. He'd been asking questions, digging into old files without permission. The absence at mile marker 237 became a wound in the landscape, a place where the temperature always felt slightly colder. Truckers avoided pulling over there. Locals told stories, some about sightings, others about sounds at night. In the years that followed, hikers occasionally stumbled upon makeshift shrines along that stretch. A rusted toy car nailed to a fence post, a child's drawing weighted with stones, a photograph warped from rain and time. No one ever claimed responsibility for placing them. For Glenn and Mara, that desolate mile of road was not just a place on a map, it was the edge of a vanishing point. A place where time stuttered and the world looked away, where the summer of 1984 didn't end, but instead unraveled slowly, under the weight of dust, memory, and questions that would echo for decades. The last time anyone heard Glenn Harlan's voice, it was just past 7 p.m. The sun was slipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the highway. The dispatch logs recorded a brief radio check-in routine, unremarkable at first glance. But when the tape was played back later, something about it didn't sit right. The cadence was off. The confidence that usually anchored Glenn's words was missing, replaced by a kind of tightness in his throat. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was deeper, more fragile. Like he was carrying something that might shatter if he spoke too clearly. Unit 12 to 09, westbound, passing. Mile 235, he said. Making good time. ETA 2, the transmission broke for a moment. Then a faint click, A pause, and what came next was quieter, almost whispered. "If anything happens, tell Rachel she was right." Static surged like a wave, washing away whatever followed. At the precinct, no one noticed at first. Glenn had always been a cautious man, borderline obsessive, according to some. He filed reports twice as long as they needed to be. He logged every stop, every interaction, every gut feeling. To most of his colleagues, he was just the guy who never cut corners. The guy who ran background checks on new recruits, even when no one asked him to. But over the months leading up to the trip, that caution began to crack into something else. He'd been seen poring over old case files in the records room well past midnight. He'd stop mid-conversation and glance over his shoulder. He'd flinch when the phone rang. When pressed, he shrugged it off, just a cold case he couldn't shake, just dots he thought he might connect. But there were no dots, not officially. Whatever Glenn was chasing, it wasn't in the department's current workload. And that made people nervous. The audio from that final transmission was reviewed by a technician days later. Not because it had been flagged, but because someone needed to complete the backlog of incident logs. That's when it became clear Glenn hadn't meant it as a routine update. His voice was shaking. Not with panic, but with resignation. Like a man who knows he's being watched, but also knows it's already too late. Rachel Harlan, Glenn's sister, was the only one who understood the weight of those last words. Tell Rachel she was right. She'd told him to stay off that case. Told him some things were buried for a reason. But Glenn was stubborn. Once he started digging, he didn't stop. The strange part was, she never knew which case he meant. He'd been vague, almost evasive. All she had was a note he left weeks before the trip, torn from a legal pad. 3 words scrawled in all caps: "It goes deep." Investigators listened to that radio clip dozens of times. Some said there was something else layered beneath the static. A faint breath, a second voice, a noise that didn't belong to the road or the signal interference. But digital forensics couldn't confirm anything. The original tape was stored, then lost, then found again years later, warped and damaged, like everything else tied to the Harlan case. In the end, it wasn't the words Glenn said that haunted people. It was the silence that followed. The way the transmission ended, not with a goodbye or a clear sign-off, but with the slow, unraveling hiss of dead air. As though the man had spoken his truth into the void, and the void, indifferent and infinite, had swallowed it whole. The letters arrived sporadically, each one postmarked from a different small town scattered along the jagged arc of their road trip. Stanley, Idaho, Falls, Chalice, Butte. They came in standard white envelopes, hand-addressed in the soft, looping script of a 17-year-old girl still caught somewhere between childhood and independence. The paper was always the same, lined notebook pages, folded carefully, never torn. And each letter opened with the same greeting: "Hi, Mom," even though her mother had been gone for nearly 7 years. It was a habit Mara couldn't break, or maybe one she didn't want to. In those letters, Mara's voice came alive, bright and restless, filled with observations about the world outside the car window. She wrote about a fox she spotted trotting along the tree line at dawn, about the strange purple light of dusk in the Idaho hills, about the couple in the next booth at the diner who whispered like they were guarding secrets. There were small, whimsical sketches in the margins: gas pumps with crooked grins, a pine tree with sad eyes, a highway sign turned into a gallows. She didn't explain them, she never needed to. But as the days passed, a subtle shift crept into her tone. The early excitement gave way to unease. In a letter from Dillon, Montana, she wrote, "Dad's acting weird again. He keeps looking over his shoulder like someone's following us. I asked if everything was okay, and he just said, 'Keep your window rolled up at night.'" The sentence stood alone, circled once in blue ink. By the next letter, the drawings had changed. Gone were the smiling trees and daydream doodles. Instead, a motel key. a shadow outside a window, a highway stretching into a void. Mara never outright said she was scared, but she didn't have to. Her words took on the rhythm of someone cataloging a world that didn't make sense anymore. We were supposed to stop at Glacier, but Dad changed his mind. Said we needed to make better time, but then we just drove in circles for half the day. It's like he's stalling or waiting for something. In another letter, sent from Missoula, she wrote, "Last night he sat in the car for over an hour, just staring at the glove box. I think he's hiding something. I heard him on the phone, but when I came close, he hung up. I asked him who he was talking to, and he said, 'No one you'd want to meet.' Then he smiled, but not in the way people are supposed to." The final letter was never mailed. It was found tucked between the pages of a library book Mara had borrowed 2 weeks before they vanished. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just written thoughts, as if she needed to get them out of her head. "Sometimes I think he brought me out here to protect me," she wrote. "Other times I think he brought me out here to say goodbye." No one knows what happened between that last entry and the moment their trail went cold. But those letters became a fragile record of dissent, a chronicle of a daughter watching her father slip into a version of himself she didn't recognize. Not a monster, not a stranger, but a man at war with shadows no one else could see. And through her quiet, careful words, Mara left behind more than a clue. She left a voice. One that still echoes, unanswered, across the lonely backroads of the American West. Glenn Harlan wore his uniform like armor, pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut. But the badge on his chest didn't just signify service, it carried a weight few others understood. Internal affairs was a different kind of policing. It meant investigating your own. It meant walking into rooms where eyes narrowed, conversations fell quiet, and old friendships evaporated. Glenn never seemed to mind. He told people he didn't join the force to make friends. He joined to keep the rot from spreading. But even those closest to him knew there was something about the job that had changed him. Years earlier, he'd been just another patrolman, a reliable, quiet fixture in the precinct. Dependable. Dull, even. But when he moved into IA, something hardened. His reports grew more meticulous. His questions cut deeper. He didn't just chase down procedural errors. He pursued moral failure like it was personal. And the deeper he dug, the more he seemed to carry something inside him. A weight that never left his eyes. By 1983, Glenn had earned a reputation for being relentless, and in law enforcement, that was a double-edged sword. Colleagues started calling him the priest behind his back, not for holiness, but because he always seemed to show up when someone's sins were about to be laid bare. Most didn't want to cross him. A few made sure he knew they already had. There were flattened tires, rumors floated through locker rooms, and more than once, anonymous notes slipped into his case files. But Glenn never flinched. Or if he did, he never let anyone see it. That's what made the folder so strange. It wasn't official. It had no case number, no departmental markings. Just a plain manila envelope, marked only with a single letter, L. Glenn had taken it home, against protocol. Kept it in his desk drawer beneath an old service pistol and a small bottle of aspirin. Rachel, his sister, found it weeks after his disappearance, when she was helping clean out his townhouse. Inside were photocopies of booking records, mugshots, and what appeared to be ledger pages written in shorthand. There were photos of men in uniform meeting in unmarked lots, license plates, timestamps, coded initials, but no context, no narrative, just fragments. One name repeated more than others, Marshall Keene. A decorated sergeant who had retired early, citing health issues. But Glenn's notes in the margins told a different story. Keene equals wrong arrests, follow $. Another read, motel receipts don't match duty logs. Why? Scribbled in red ink near the bottom of one page, if this goes public, I'm next. The official line later claimed the folder was unrelated. Misfiled documents, speculation, coincidence. But those who had worked with Glenn knew better. He had started digging somewhere he wasn't supposed to. And the trip with Mara, the detour through forgotten towns and barren highways, it wasn't just about bonding. It was about buying time. About distance. About hiding her from something, or someone, that had already begun closing in. He never turned the folder in, never filed a report. The evidence, like Glenn himself, slipped between the cracks. And what remained was the echo of a man who refused to look the other way until the shadow he hunted reached out and pulled him under. The file was thin. Too thin for a missing persons case involving a police officer and his teenage daughter. It fit inside a single manila envelope, barely a handful of typed pages, 2 blurry photographs, and a missing vehicle report. The date on the final page confirmed what most already suspected. The case had been closed less than 3 weeks after Glenn and Mara Harlan vanished. No further action recommended. Presumed dead. No foul play suspected. To the public, it was a tragic but unremarkable loss. Another roadside accident in the vast, indifferent sprawl of the American West. The narrative was simple, almost comforting in its fatalism. A wrong turn along an unguarded cliff. Maybe fatigue or a blown tire. Maybe a misjudged curve under moonlight. The terrain was unforgiving. Bodies are rarely recovered. Closure was a formality no one could promise. But to those who knew Glenn, even to those who only knew of him, the speed with which the case was buried felt deliberate. The sheriff's department in Lemhi County, the last known jurisdiction Glenn passed through, handled the report with a level of detachment that bordered on disinterest. A single deputy was assigned to follow up on sightings. When the motel manager reported that Glenn and Mara had failed to show for their reservation, the incident was noted but never followed up. No search warrants were issued, no vehicles were traced. The missing car, an easily identifiable dark green Dodge Diplomat, was never entered into broader APBs. It was as if the road had simply opened its jaws and swallowed the Harlans whole, and the town had already learned not to look too closely at what the earth decides to keep. Local journalists at the time tried to ask questions. A reporter from a small Twin Falls weekly wrote a piece titled, "No One Goes Missing Quietly." It was pulled from circulation within a day. The paper's editor later admitted, off the record, that someone from state law enforcement called and advised them to leave the matter be. No threats, no legal jargon, just a quiet, chilling warning, like a door softly closing. Even Glenn's own department back in Oregon didn't seem eager to push. His locker was emptied, his desk cleared, his files archived without review. A memorial was held, a small one, closed to press. A folded flag was given to Rachel. There were no eulogies, no bagpipes, no badge retired in his honor. It was the kind of quiet that felt forced, like a breath being held. Rachel never accepted the cliff story. Glenn didn't believe in accidents, not the kind that left no evidence. He didn't trust coincidence, and he would have never driven that stretch of road in the dark without alerting someone to his location. She asked questions, filed FOIA requests, dug through old route maps, tracked rest stop logs. She found discrepancies, receipts that didn't match known stops, fuel logs that suggested miles unaccounted for. But when she tried to bring her findings to the attention of state authorities, she was met with polite silence. Doors closed, emails went unanswered. It became clear the case wasn't just ignored, it was made invisible. Years later, when the case would resurface, when the bloodstained suitcase emerged and the timeline began to crack open, those early weeks, the rushed reports, the missing follow-up, the strangely subdued response took on a new shape. Not incompetence, not indifference, but something colder. The kind of silence that protects more than it forgets. It was late afternoon when the waitress saw her. The diner sat just off a rural junction near Dillon, Montana, an aging prefab structure with a rusted sign that read, "Betty's." Though no one named Betty had worked there in over a decade. Business was slow that day. mostly truckers and tired travelers passing through. The girl came in just before sunset, her hair tied back in a messy braid, her face drawn in a way that didn't match her age. She was young, 17, maybe 18, but something about her eyes made her look older. She sat in the far booth, the one next to the payphone, and she didn't touch the menu. The man who came in with her wasn't wearing a uniform. He looked too casual to be a father, too stiff to be a boyfriend. Button-down shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes constantly flicking toward the window. He said they were waiting for someone. Ordered coffee, nothing for her. The girl didn't speak until he left to use the restroom. That's when the waitress approached. She didn't remember exactly what she said, something polite, small talk. But what stuck with her was the way the girl asked, "Is there a bus station near here?" Not panicked, not loud. Just quiet, cautious, like she was testing the air for danger. When the man returned, he placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and gave the waitress a look she wouldn't forget. Not angry, not threatening, just cold. The girl fell silent. They left shortly after, walking out into the dying light and disappearing behind the glare of a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. The car had been parked at the edge of the lot, just beyond the range of the old security camera that hadn't worked in years. The waitress reported the encounter a week later, after hearing about the disappearance on the evening news. She wasn't certain it was the same girl, but the photo they showed Mara, smiling awkwardly in that last Polaroid, was close enough to rattle her. She called the tip line, spoke to a deputy, described what she saw. She even offered to draw the man's face, said she had studied art in college before life got in the way. The deputy said someone would follow up. No one did. The report ended up buried in the overflow box at the sheriff's office. One of dozens of tips that arrived in the flurry of early attention, most of them dead ends. Years later, when the case was briefly reopened, a young detective found the waitress's statement folded between two unrelated files. It was handwritten, signed, and dated. Clear, articulate, filled with specific details. And yet it had never been added to the case log. No follow-up interview, no plate numbers recorded, no composite sketch ever made. The woman in the blue sedan never surfaced again. The vehicle was never traced. And the girl who might have been Mara left behind no name, no receipt, no physical proof she had ever been there at all. Just a memory in the mind of a waitress who still swore the girl looked terrified and that the man she was with wasn't her father. Not even close. In the years that followed the disappearance, the world moved on as it always does. News faded, faces aged, names were slowly buried beneath new tragedies. Fresher headlines. Glenn's wife, already worn thin by years of emotional distance and quiet resentment, remarried. She sold the house, left town, and never spoke Glenn's name again in public. She told people it was better that way for closure, for peace, for Mara's memory. But others knew she wasn't mourning anymore. She was surviving. Mara's friends, those teenage companions who once shared secrets in soda cans beneath bleachers and trees, tried to hold on at first. They lit candles, wore ribbons, spoke about her like she was still coming back. But after a year passed and the seasons turned again, their memories blurred at the edges. College swallowed them up. Careers pulled them elsewhere. Weddings, babies, relocations. Eventually, Mara became little more than a sad story they only half remembered, the kind of thing brought up once every few years over wine or coffee. Remember that girl, the one who disappeared with her dad? But Rachel Harlan never forgot. She carried Glenn's absence like a stone in her chest, not just because he was her brother, but because she knew deep down that something about the official story was wrong. Not just wrong, but empty. She knew Glenn too well. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't spontaneous. He wouldn't just vanish into the dirt without leaving some kind of trail, no matter how faint. And Mara, she was bright, resourceful. She would have found a way to reach out, unless something or someone had made that impossible. Rachel's life slowly twisted around the hole they left behind. She stopped teaching, spent her savings on public records, police reports, long-distance phone calls to sheriffs who barely remembered the case. She built timelines on her living room wall. Red threads stretched between photos, dates, receipts. She logged every anomaly, every unidentified vehicle report along that stretch of highway in August 1984. Every missing person case that overlapped their timeline. Every motel ledger that showed scribbled-out names or changed reservations. She wrote letters to departments that never replied. She visited old detectives in nursing homes, hoping one of them might say something they weren't allowed to back then. She wasn't looking for justice. Not anymore. She was looking for connection, any sign that someone, somewhere, had seen them. That they hadn't simply ceased to exist. Years turned to decades. Boxes of research gathered dust in her garage. She drove the same route every August, retracing their last known steps. At every rest stop, she would pause, get out of the car, and listen. Sometimes, she'd bring Mara's favorite cassette tapes and let them play into the empty air. Not out of ritual, but hope. That maybe something would stir. That maybe something had been waiting all this time. The law had long stopped looking. The public had long stopped caring. But Rachel kept going, driven by an ache she couldn't name and a promise she never said aloud, that they would not be forgotten. Not while she still had breath in her. Not while even the faintest sliver of the truth remained buried in the silence. It was a dry September morning when the hiker found it. The air was brittle with the promise of early frost, and the sky hung low with the pale, washed-out blue that only comes after too many weeks without rain. He had veered off the trail, looking for a quiet spot to rest near a long-forgotten creek bed just outside Red Rock Lakes in rural Montana. The creek itself was little more than a scar in the earth, cracked, silent, thirsty. But what caught his eye wasn't the land. It was the corner of something unnatural jutting from the dirt, faded canvas. A tarnished metal buckle. A suitcase, half consumed by time. At first, he thought it might have been discarded years ago, like so many other forgotten things along the forgotten edges of the wilderness. But when he knelt beside it, brushing back the soil with the sleeve of his jacket, a chill crept over him that had nothing to do with the weather. The zipper, rusted and stiff, groaned as he pried it open. What he found inside would fracture a silence that had lasted 16 years. The clothes were the first thing he saw. Folded at odd angles, darkened with time, and stained in patterns that spoke too clearly of violence. A denim jacket, torn at the cuff. A flannel shirt soaked through with an old, oxidized red. Beneath them, a pair of white sneakers, one missing its laces. Tucked into a side pouch was a silver locket, scratched and dulled but still intact. It opened with a soft click. Inside was a photo blurred with moisture, but unmistakable. A girl with bright eyes and a crooked smile, Mara Harlan. And at the very bottom of the case, wrapped in what remained of a plastic grocery bag, was a police badge. The number still visible. The name etched beneath the county seal, Officer Glenn Harlan. The badge was bent slightly at one edge, as if it had once been stepped on. The hiker drove into town in silence, the suitcase riding in the trunk like a ghost he didn't know how to name. By nightfall, the sheriff's office in Beaverhead County was crawling with state investigators. The site was marked, cordoned off, photographed from every angle. Forensics teams arrived within days, picking through the dirt with gloved hands and quiet dread. DNA analysis confirmed what many feared. The blood belonged to Mara. But the suitcase held no body, no bones, just fragments. News of the discovery spread quickly, dredging up headlines long thought retired. The case of the vanished policeman and his daughter, once deemed unsolvable, was suddenly reborn in whispers and headlines. Journalists scrambled to revisit a mystery they had long abandoned. Questions flooded in faster than answers. Why here? Why now? And who had buried the suitcase so carefully, only to leave it vulnerable to time and erosion? Rachel Harlan was the first family member to be notified. When she arrived to identify the locket and badge, she didn't cry. She simply placed her hand on the metal, held it for a moment, and said, "It was never an accident." And in that moment, the story shifted. This was no longer a disappearance. It was the scene of a crime. Beneath the blood-stained layers of fabric and the tarnished badge, nestled between crumpled receipts and forgotten motel brochures, there was something quieter, less dramatic, but more haunting. A single envelope, yellowing at the edges yet perfectly sealed. It had escaped the slow decay that had claimed nearly everything else in the suitcase. No tears, no smudges. Just the initials written across the front in careful, slanted handwriting. M.H. It was unmistakable. Glenn's handwriting, precise, deliberate, old-fashioned. The kind of cursive taught in classrooms decades ago, now fading with the generation that carried it. Forensic specialists later confirmed the ink had been set no more than a few days before Glenn and Mara disappeared. The pen strokes were clean, the seal unbroken. Whatever Glenn had meant to say in those pages, he never got the chance to deliver them. When Rachel was shown the envelope, she didn't ask for gloves or privacy. She took it in both hands, stared at the initials for a long while, then handed it back. "I can't read it," she said, her voice hollow. "That letter wasn't meant for me." The authorities debated whether to open it immediately, citing potential evidence. Ultimately, the decision fell to the lead investigator, who opened the flap with the kind of reverence usually reserved for confessionals or final words. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded into thirds. The ink had held, the words were legible, but what they revealed raised more questions than it answered. "Dear Mara," it began. "If you're reading this, something's gone wrong." There was no greeting beyond that, no warm preamble, no attempts at comfort. Glenn had written like a man pressed for time, his sentences clipped, his tone urgent. He mentioned things I've seen, people who don't want to be found, and a file something he believed could unravel it all. He said he was sorry for dragging her into it. Said he thought taking her on the road would keep her safe, that distance would buy them time. But time, he admitted, was running out. Then came a line that stopped investigators cold. "They know who you are now. That changes everything." He didn't elaborate. He didn't say who they were or how Mara was involved. But the letter implied something larger, deeper, a shadow beneath the case that no one had dared to examine. Toward the end, his writing grew shaky, as if the weight of what he was confessing had finally broken through his composure. "I never wanted you to see the worst of what I've seen. I thought I could bury it before it reached you. I was wrong. If you get out, if you're reading this alone, run. Don't look back. Don't trust anyone who says they're trying to help." He signed it Dad. No closing message, no reassurance. Just those final 3 words, underscored once in heavy ink. Forensic specialists found no fingerprints other than Glenn's. No signs the letter had been tampered with. It had remained untouched since the moment he sealed it. A message in a bottle, buried for 16 years in silence and soil. The contents of that letter were not made public, but it shifted the case into something darker. This was not just a father trying to protect his daughter. This was a man who believed they were already being hunted. And whatever Glenn uncovered, whatever led him to write that letter, it was enough to make him believe the only way to keep Mara alive was to vanish with her. But the letter never reached her. And its silence, like the suitcase that held it, only deepened the mystery. The suitcase had already rewritten the story once. The bloodied clothes, the badge, the letter, they shifted the case from tragic accident to chilling possibility. But it was what lay deep in the seams of the suitcase, nearly invisible, that would unravel everything the authorities thought they understood. In a frayed corner near the lining, a single strand of hair had been trapped in the zipper's teeth, preserved by dust and time. At first, it seemed insignificant. Contamination was always a risk. After all, 16 years had passed. But protocol demanded it be tested. The results came back within weeks. The blood on the denim jacket was conclusively Mara's. That was never in doubt. It confirmed she had been injured badly, judging by the saturation. But the hair didn't belong to Glenn. It didn't belong to Mara either. Male. Unidentified. No match in national criminal databases. No match to anyone connected to the Harlan family. The profile wasn't partial. It was clean, fresh, intact. A third person had handled those clothes or been close enough, long enough, to leave a part of themselves behind. The implications were immediate. If Glenn and Mara had vanished together, if the dominant theory for over a decade had been a single vehicle accident, father and daughter lost to the elements, then who was this man? And what was his DNA doing mixed in with the clothing Mara had bled through? For investigators, it was like a jigsaw puzzle that had been assembled into the wrong picture. Every piece still fit, but now the image was shifting, darkening. Some wondered if this third party had been the driver of the blue sedan, reported by the waitress in Dillon. Others speculated the man might have been connected to whatever Glenn had been digging into before the trip. Some shadow from within law enforcement, some old case come back to haunt him. But the most disturbing possibility was the simplest one. This person was there when Mara bled. And Glenn wasn't. That meant, at least for a time, they had been separated. It was a detail that haunted Rachel Harlan. She had always feared the worst, but the idea that Mara had been alive after Glenn was gone, that someone else had taken control in that gap of time, was unbearable. It added layers to the letter, to the final transmission, to every red flag the investigation had ignored. Glenn hadn't just been scared. He knew. The DNA finding reignited interest in the case, sparking a wave of tips and armchair theories. Some claimed Glenn had staged the entire disappearance to hide Mara from someone dangerous. Others suggested he'd been eliminated first, and Mara taken by whoever he was running from. A few believed Mara was still alive, that she'd escaped and gone underground, unable or unwilling to come forward. The suitcase, they said, was a warning or a grave marker. But the third DNA profile remained a void. No name, no face, just a quiet presence, threaded through the fabric of a mystery long considered dormant. Law enforcement reopened the case formally that fall, though privately, many admitted they were now chasing ghosts. The suitcase had given them new evidence, but it had also fractured the narrative into something messier, crueler. It didn't offer closure. It offered questions. And at the center of all of them stood an unnamed man whose shadow now loomed over everything that followed. The motel stood at the edge of nowhere, a crumbling skeleton of its former self. Long since boarded up, its sign bleached blank by years of sun and wind. The roadside inn near the Montana border had become a relic in the dust, a place people passed without noticing. But in the wake of the suitcase's discovery and the DNA that didn't belong, everything connected to the Harlan disappearance was re-examined. And the motel long dismissed came into focus again, not because of a tip, not because of new testimony, but because of a forgotten ledger. The discovery was accidental. A county records officer clearing out old archives stumbled across a cardboard box filled with business licenses and logs from now defunct establishments. Among them was a thick, water-damaged guestbook wrapped in twine. Faded ink bled across the pages, names written in slanted cursive and rushed print, room numbers noted, rates scribbled in the margins. It was a register of comings and goings, each line a quiet echo of someone who once passed through. Toward the middle of the book, tucked between August 17th and 18th, 1984, there was a curious entry. Room 3B. The line originally listed a name that had been heavily scratched out more than once, with deep, angry pressure. Underneath, in newer ink, the space had been filled with a name that jolted everyone who saw it: Mr. and Miss Harlan. At first glance, it seemed promising. Proof that Glenn and Mara had stayed there. Proof that they were still traveling after their last confirmed sighting. But something didn't add up. Glenn was not known for calling himself Mr. in formal settings, especially not when traveling with Mara. And Miss Harlan? He would have used her full name Mara or listed them separately. That was who he was. Precise, procedural, always exact. Forensic handwriting analysts were brought in to examine the change. The conclusion came quickly. The handwriting didn't match Glenn's. Not even close. The loops were wider, the pressure inconsistent, the angle unfamiliar. Someone else had written their names into the ledger. Someone who had first tried to erase a different identity, then overwrite it with Glenn's. It was the kind of discovery that felt like a trapdoor opening beneath the timeline. If Glenn and Mara hadn't checked into the motel themselves, then who had? And more importantly, why? A former employee was tracked down. An aging night manager who hadn't thought about the place in years. He remembered little. Business was slow in those days. Travelers didn't stay long. But when shown the register, something flickered behind his eyes. He recalled a man who arrived late alone, he thought, but who insisted on paying for 2 guests. Cash, no ID. The man was clean-cut, polite, but strange. When asked for a name, he hesitated, then gave it softly. Harlan. The manager hadn't thought twice. People lie on ledgers all the time, no big deal. But when pressed further, he said something else. He was nervous, kept looking at the road like someone might follow him. And he had a bag with him. Heavy one. Like he didn't trust it out of his sight. The ledger was logged into evidence. But like so many pieces of this story, it didn't offer answers, just more fractures in the foundation. Someone had tried to place Glenn and Mara there, to anchor them in a moment that may never have happened. It raised a new and horrifying possibility, that someone had been impersonating them. Or perhaps only one of them had ever made it to that motel at all. The footage was grainy, degraded by time and neglect, stored on a VHS cassette that had spent over a decade gathering dust in a cardboard box, marked July Sept. '84. It came from a forgotten security system at a gas station near Lima, Montana, just north of the place where Glenn and Mara had last been seen. No one remembered the camera had even existed until the case was reopened. When it was finally found and digitized, the tape was thought to be little more than a formality. One more thread to tug on in a story already tangled beyond recognition. But what it captured was more than routine surveillance. It was a moment suspended in time, fleeting and haunting. The timestamp read the 18th of August, 1984, 6:42 p.m. The angle was limited, fixed high in the corner above the register. It faced the entrance and offered a partial view of the exterior through the station's front window. Most of the early footage was mundane. Customers drifting in, paying for fuel, chatting with the clerk, grabbing snacks. But then, just before the timestamp flipped to 6:43, she appeared. Mara. She stood just inside the frame of the doorway, hesitant, almost as if uncertain whether she should come in. Her hair was loose around her face, tangled and windblown. She wasn't wearing the denim jacket from the Polaroid or the same shirt noted in the missing persons flyer. Her clothes looked rumpled, possibly stained, though the footage wasn't clear enough to confirm. What was undeniable, however, was the expression on her face. She was crying. Not the theatrical kind of crying, no wild sobs or collapsed shoulders. Just a silent, desperate sort of grief, the kind that has already moved beyond panic. She kept glancing back over her shoulder, not toward the road, but toward the pump stations, toward something or someone out of frame. For nearly 30 seconds, she lingered in the entrance. She took a step forward, then stopped. She looked directly toward the register, but no clerk was present. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, a figure moved behind her. Only a sliver of the man was visible, a shoulder, part of an arm, the edge of a face caught in the curve of the window's reflection. He stepped toward her, and Mara flinched. That's what investigators noted in their report. Her body jerked slightly, not out of surprise, but something closer to dread. She didn't look at him. She looked down. Then he stepped back, out of frame. And Mara disappeared with him. When the clerk returned 42 seconds later, the frame was empty again. The girl had never entered, no purchase, no interaction, no record. Just a ghost captured in analog, preserved by accident. Analysts ran enhancement software, trying to isolate the man's features, to clean the blur into something that could match a mugshot or a face in a file. But the resolution was too low, the shadows too deep. They got nothing conclusive. Just a shape, a presence. What disturbed investigators most wasn't what the tape showed, but what it implied. Mara had a window, a moment. She had almost reached safety, had almost stepped inside, almost asked for help. But something, or someone, had pulled her back. The gas station footage was logged, archived, and added to the ever-growing list of moments where the story almost changed. It didn't explain what happened before or after. It didn't tell where Glenn was or who the man had been. But it proved one thing beyond doubt. Mara had been alive that day, scared, alone, looking for a way out, and no one came. The man's name was Carl Denton. Retired now, living quietly in a double-wide on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. He spent his days fishing when his knees allowed, and tinkering with a rusted-out Harley. He swore he'd finish restoring any year now. He wasn't a man of theatrics. His memory wasn't perfect, but what he saw that night in 1984 had never left him. Not the way the headlights cut through the dark like teeth. Not the shape of the girl in the passenger seat, and especially not the look on her face. Carl came forward only after the news broke about the bloodstained suitcase. For years, he'd kept the memory to himself. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that no one had ever asked. The case had gone cold so quickly, the disappearance of a father and daughter fading beneath newer, louder tragedies. He'd caught the name Harlan on the news, and something tightened in his chest. He called the hotline the next day. "I saw the car," he told the detective. It was one of those old Dodge Diplomats. Cops used to drive 'em back then. No mistaking the shape. I passed it maybe 20-30 miles outside Lemhi Pass. Middle of nowhere. Was pulled over to the side of the road, lights off. Thought it was strange for a cop not to run hazard lights at night. The detective asked him if he remembered the time. Carl didn't hesitate. Had just passed midnight. "I remember because I was debating whether to pull off and sleep or push through to Salmon." He adjusted his cap, voice tightening. "But here's the thing. When I passed the car, I looked over. Habit, you know? And the guy in the driver's seat? He wasn't a cop. He was too young. Couldn't have been more than 25. Thin, dark hair. Wearing what looked like a uniform shirt, but it was open at the collar. No badge, no radio." Carl's rig had slowed down slightly as he passed. Enough for him to get a better look. That's when he saw her, the girl in the passenger seat. Slumped against the window, her head lolling gently with the motion. Something about her posture struck him as wrong. She wasn't asleep, he said. She was out of it. Not moving much. Eyes half open, like she was there, but not there. He didn't stop. Not because he didn't want to, but because he told himself maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was a cop's kid who'd fallen asleep on a long shift. Maybe he was overthinking. But the feeling that settled in his gut as he pulled away stuck with him for years. They were facing the other direction, he said quietly. Not toward the next town. Like they'd already been there and were doubling back. The detective asked him if he could describe the man again. Carl tried. Oval face, sharp jaw, clean-shaven. Eyes that didn't meet his as he passed. Just stared ahead, knuckles white on the wheel. "He didn't look surprised to see me," Carl added. "He looked like he was waiting for someone else." The detail was logged, but there was no license plate, no dashcam, no way to verify what Carl had seen beyond his word. And yet his account aligned with too much: the location, the timeline, the direction. It added weight to the theory that Glenn had already been separated from Mara by that point, or worse. Carl Denton returned to his quiet life after the interview, though something about the conversation shook him. Before hanging up, he said just one more thing, almost as if to himself. She didn't look scared. She looked resigned. Like someone who knew the road wasn't going to save her. The suitcase had spent 16 years hidden, aging quietly beneath soil and stone before time and chance forced it into the light. But it hadn't always been where the hiker found it. That was the first thing forensic analysts determined once they began their quiet dissection of its secrets. It wasn't just what the suitcase contained, it was what clung to it. Fragments of a different world, traces of a burial site far from where it was finally discovered. The dirt pressed into its seams didn't match the dry, high-altitude silt of the Red Rock Creek bed where it was unearthed. Instead, microscopic analysis revealed a composition rich in decomposed pine needles, clay-heavy sediment, and volcanic ash. Mixed in were spores from a type of fern that didn't grow anywhere near the site. Botanists narrowed the plant life down to a low, shaded canyon 3 counties east, near the Bitterroot Range. That region was denser, wetter, more remote. The kind of place where someone could bury something with the confidence that it would stay buried. Entomologists joined the inquiry, examining the remains of beetles and insect larvae caught in the inner folds of the suitcase lining. The types found suggested it had been stored underground in a cooler, shaded microclimate, likely during the fall. But the species were inconsistent with the ones native to the area it had been recovered in. Combined with the soil and pollen data, the conclusion became inescapable. The suitcase had been relocated. And not recently, not hurriedly. Someone had exhumed it from its original resting place years earlier, possibly as early as the late 92nds, only to rebury it in a far more accessible exposed location. The question was, why? If the suitcase had remained hidden for over a decade, if whoever buried it had succeeded in keeping it secret for so long, what would prompt them to move it? It made no sense from a logical perspective. Moving it increased the risk of exposure. It opened the door to discovery, which is exactly what happened. The relocation was not an act of concealment. It was an act of intent. Some investigators theorized it was a signal, a breadcrumb, not from a perpetrator, but possibly from someone complicit, someone whose guilt had curdled over time. Perhaps they wanted it found. Not the whole truth, but just enough to ensure the case wasn't forgotten. Others believed the move was more sinister. A warning, a taunt. A calculated placement designed to provoke, to reignite a fire that had long since burned out. The new burial site, shallow, near a public hiking path, was too careless to be coincidence. And yet, the suitcase was positioned deliberately. Facing east, covered, but not deeply. Almost like it had been placed to wait for someone. Rachel Harlan believed it was meant for her. She had walked those hills many times over the years, always within a few miles of where the suitcase was finally found. She believed the person who moved it knew that. Knew she would return. That she would never stop looking. And that eventually, she would be close enough for fate or cruelty to bridge the distance. Whoever moved the suitcase did so with purpose. Not to hide the past, but to wake it up. The shift in soil wasn't just geographical, it was emotional. A message written in dust and bone. You missed something. Come back. Look again. And Rachel did. Long before the road trip, long before the suitcase and the suitcase's silence. Long before the headlines faded and the search turned cold. Glenn Harlan had begun to pull at threads most men would have left untouched. It started in whispers, cases that didn't add up, reports that contradicted each other, seized evidence that never made it to storage. At first, it looked like sloppiness. But the more Glenn reviewed, the more he saw a pattern emerge. Certain names kept surfacing in the margins. Certain arrests were made, and then quietly dropped. Offenders disappeared, records vanished. Entire case files were rewritten, or worse, erased. Glenn had been working in internal affairs for 4 years when he first stumbled across the discrepancies. One case in particular lodged itself in his mind. A simple narcotics bust in Klamath Falls. Standard paperwork, minor offender. But the evidence log listed items that didn't match the arrest report. A second bag of drugs, a different caliber weapon. No court record ever followed. Glenn checked with the arresting officer. The man claimed he'd never filed the report. The signature wasn't his. Most officers would have filed it away as a clerical error. Glenn didn't. He began to dig quietly at first, after hours, sifting through archived case files, pulling paper copies when digital records failed to match, and what he found went beyond mishandled evidence. There were patterns, reused aliases, fake identities tied to confidential informants that didn't exist. Vehicles seized during drug arrests were re-registered under shell names. Confiscated money marked for destruction was logged in amounts that didn't align with banking slips. And behind it all, the same cluster of initials kept appearing. Different cases, different counties, same handwriting, same red ink. He never reported his findings formally. Not yet. Instead, Glenn created his own records, a second set of files, hidden and meticulously documented. Rachel would later find fragments of them in his home office, buried under false bottom drawers and wedged into hollowed-out books. The entries read like a man building a case not for court, but for survival. Names were listed with question marks. Some were underlined twice, others marked with a single word beside them. Untouchable. The rot wasn't just inside one department. It reached across state lines. Officers who transferred quietly when internal audits came too close. Surveillance logs that disappeared from evidence rooms. Glenn believed he was circling something larger than he could see, a ring tied together, not by loyalty, but by silence and mutually assured ruin. And then, sometime in early August of 1984, Glenn stopped talking. Colleagues noticed the shift. He grew colder, more withdrawn. He declined backup on routine checks. He started locking his office, even during working hours. Whatever he had found, whatever he had confirmed, had crossed a line from suspicion to certainty. But Glenn didn't trust the system to protect him. That much was clear. He didn't go to the press. He didn't go to his superiors. He packed his car, took his daughter, and vanished onto the open road. Theories later speculated he had planned to meet someone. A leak, a witness, someone who could help him bring the truth to light without exposing Mara to the danger directly. But if that was true, then it meant someone else knew he was coming. Someone who wanted the truth buried alongside him. The most chilling part wasn't the evidence itself. It was how cleanly it had all been erased after Glenn disappeared. Files he once checked out were never returned, and no requests were ever made to retrieve them. His inquiries into the narcotics task force were deleted from the system within a week. Internal logs were scrubbed. Like Glenn Harlan had never been a threat at all, except to the people who made him disappear. Long after the office lights had dimmed and the last of the detectives had gone home, a single ring, then another. The machine picked up, standard recording. "You've reached the Harlan task force. Please leave your message." There was a pause, then static. Then a voice, faint and altered, like it was being filtered through a wall of water and wires. "He tried to save me," it said. Female, uncertain, cracking slightly at the end. "He died for what he found." Then the line went dead. It lasted 8 seconds. Just long enough to send a ripple through everything. At first, no one believed it could be real. Crank calls were common, especially in cold cases that had caught media attention again. Every amateur sleuth wanted to be part of the story, and every cruel prankster wanted to stir the wound. But there was something different about this one. The voice, though distorted, carried a tremor that felt too precise to fake. A kind of haunted calm that didn't sound like theater. It sounded like someone who had stopped running just long enough to whisper through the dark. The task force acted quickly. The call had come through a VoIP service, rerouted multiple times, but still left behind a trace barely enough to track, but enough to follow. Eventually, they located the source. A prepaid burner phone, purchased in cash from a gas station in Idaho Falls just 6 days prior. The clerk didn't remember the buyer. Surveillance footage was already erased. And by the time agents arrived, the phone had been powered off, battery removed, number disconnected. But it was what the tech analysts uncovered that kept the investigation alive. The audio was cleaned, digitally enhanced. Filters peeled back the distortion layer by layer until something began to take shape. Not a clear identity, not a confirmed match, but a voice print. A partial signature that, when run through comparison software, aligned in tone and pitch with archived recordings of Mara Harlan. Not definitively, not conclusively, but close enough to raise the question no one had dared ask aloud in years. What if she was still alive? Rachel listened to the clip on a loop. She said nothing the first time, nor the second. But on the third, her hand tightened around the arm of the chair. "It's her," she whispered. "She's older, but that's her." She said it like a prayer, or a confession. The implications were staggering. If Mara had survived, if she had escaped whoever had taken her, if she'd stayed hidden all this time, then where had she gone? Why hadn't she come forward? Had someone forced her into silence, or had she chosen it? Some believed the call was a warning. Others believed it was a goodbye. The phrasing, the past tense, the weight of it suggested closure, not hope. "He tried to save me." Not "he's trying." Not "he's with me." The sentence rang like an obituary carved in breath. Still, it was the first new trace of Mara in over a decade. A breath in the static. A thread from the other side of a vanished life. It didn't prove she was out there, but it made forgetting her impossible. And in a case built on fragments and ghosts, her voice, whether real, imagined, or something in between, was enough to start the clock again. Because if she had called once, she might call again. And next time, someone would be listening. The creek had dried up years ago. What once carved through the valley as a restless vein of meltwater had become little more than a shallow groove in the earth, cluttered with sun-bleached stones, brittle weeds, and the occasional ghost of movement when wind passed through. It was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look, hidden beneath a bluff off a seldom-used trail in southern Montana. But one morning, months after the suitcase had been found, a local dog walker noticed something new on the riverbank. Something quiet. Something that hadn't been there before. A small wooden cross, no taller than a forearm, driven into the soil at the water's edge. Weathered pine, hand-carved, sanded down at the corners. No marker, no plaque, no message beyond a single date burned into the grain. The 18th of August 1984. It was simple. Stark. Deliberate. The sheriff's office photographed it, cataloged it, marked the GPS coordinates. They dusted it for prints, none. The soil around it had been disturbed, but not enough to suggest a burial. It had been placed there gently, without rush, by someone who knew how to move through this kind of landscape without leaving footprints. Someone who came not to perform, but to remember. What made the cross unsettling wasn't just its presence, it was its location. It stood almost exactly 60 feet from where the suitcase had been discovered. Investigators debated whether it was a memorial or a message. Some believed it was the work of a mourner, someone who had carried the memory of that day for years and had finally found the courage, or perhaps the necessity, to mark the ground where it ended. Others saw it as something darker, a claiming, a final chapter written by someone who still carried guilt like a hidden weight, unconfessed but undeniable. Rachel Harlan visited the site alone. She didn't tell the press, didn't bring the task force. She just drove out one morning with a thermos of coffee and a folded blanket and sat near the cross for hours, not touching it, not photographing it, just being with it. She would later say she didn't cry. There were no more tears left to give. But she felt something stir inside her when she saw the date carved so precisely, so cleanly. Not the pain of it, she'd lived with that for 16 years, but the fact that someone had put it there. Someone who knew. And perhaps that was the most haunting part of all. That in this world, full of records and databases, of files and footage, and DNA profiles and silence, someone still carried the memory of that day like a living wound. Not for the public, not for justice, but privately, secretly. As if their own story had ended in the same dust. The cross was eventually removed and placed into evidence, but Rachel asked for it back. Not to display, not to bury, just to keep. To hold on to the one thing in the entire investigation that wasn't a clue, or a question, or a piece of evidence left behind in panic or fear. It was something else entirely. It was grief, carved into wood. And it proved, in a way that nothing else had, that Mara and Glenn hadn't been forgotten. Not entirely, not by everyone,